She would be dead by first snow. That was the consensus, the final, gravel-voiced judgment passed down from the men who stood on the dust-blown porch of the general store. It was not a wish, they would have argued, but a simple statement of fact, as plain and unyielding as the granite peaks that tore at the sky to the east. A woman alone, 31 years old, with a body more accustomed to mending than felling, and her ancient, brittle-boned mother in tow. It was a death sentence delivered with a shrug. The town's minister, a man whose piety was as thin as his hair, had even offered a preemptive prayer for her soul, a public performance of compassion that felt more like hammering the first nail in her coffin. They gave her a week, perhaps two, before the unforgiving wilderness would claim what her husband had so callously discarded. But they never looked, not really, into Ada's eyes. They saw the slight frame, the worn dress, the exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin after Jacob had bolted the door to her own home. They did not see the quiet, unquenchable flicker of resolve that had taken root in the hollowed-out space where her heart used to be. So while they talked and predicted and pitted, Ada was already walking, her mother's frail hand in hers, heading not towards the horizon of surrender, but towards the deep, dark woods that bordered the settlement, a place they all feared. She was searching for something they could never comprehend, not an end, but a beginning, hidden within the heart of something ancient and broken, a place where a life might just be possible. They had pronounced her dead, but Ada had never felt more determined to live. Their words became the fuel, their certainty the whetstone against which she sharpened her will. The first snow could come. It would find her ready. It would find her home. The reason for her exile was as common as it was cruel. Jacob, her husband of 10 years, had found his fortunes turning sour, his ventures into land speculation collapsing like a house of dry twigs. He needed a fresh start, he declared, a new life unburdened by the old. And to him, she and her aging mother, Martha, were the heaviest of those burdens. He had not shouted, had not raised a hand. His cruelty was a colder, quieter thing. He simply packed his belongings one morning, took the last of their money, and informed her that the house had been sold from under them. "You are no longer my concern," he had said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion she could recognize. The words didn't even have the decency to be angry, they were merely transactional, the closing of a ledger. She was an entry to be struck through. He had left her on the porch with her mother, a small bundle of clothes, and the suffocating judgment of a town that saw a discarded wife not as a victim, but as a failure. The new owner wanted them gone by dusk. There was nowhere to go. The charity of the church was a shallow cup, offered with a side of humiliating sermons on the duties of a wife. The other townsfolk, friends she had known for years, now looked straight through her, their eyes averting as if her misfortune were a contagion. Her vulnerability was an inconvenience, a disruption to the orderly, patriarchal rhythm of their lives. So she had turned her back on them all. With Martha leaning heavily on her arm, Ada walked away from the straight lines and sharp angles of the town, towards the chaotic, forgiving embrace of the forest. It was there, 3 days into a desperate search for shelter, that she found it. A titan of the forest, a sequoia so vast its base was the size of a small cabin. A fire, long ago, perhaps centuries past, had burned out its heartwood, leaving a hollow, cavernous space inside, a wound in the world big enough to walk into. It was dark and smelled of damp earth and ancient wood, a place of death and decay. To any other soul, it would have been a tomb. But to Ada, standing in the gaping maw of the tree, it was a promise. It was a broken thing, just like her. And it was still standing. The work was a brutal catechism, each swing of the axe a prayer against the coming winter. She had salvaged what she could, lengths of timber discarded from the new railroad line, planks from a collapsed prospector's shack miles up the creek. She dragged them one by one, her shoulders screaming, her hands raw and bleeding, back to the giant tree. The men who saw her, lone hunters tracking deer or trappers checking their lines, would pause and watch, their expressions a mixture of pity and contempt. One of them, a burly man with a beard like rusted wire, spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near her feet. "You aim to live in that stump?" he'd asked, a laugh rumbling in his chest. "That ain't a home, woman." "It's a grave 1,000 years old," Ada didn't answer. She just hoisted another plank, the rough wood tearing at her skin, and carried on. The silence was her shield, her labor the only reply that mattered. She learned the language of wood, the give of green pine, the stubborn grain of oak. She built a floor first, to keep them off the damp earth. Then, she began to frame an interior wall, a cabin within the tree, using the curved, fire-blackened hollow as the outer shell. She stuffed the gaps with a mixture of mud, moss, and dried grasses, a technique she'd seen natives use, her hands caked in the cold, wet slurry from dawn until her fingers grew too numb to work. Her mother, Martha, would sit on a smooth stone near the entrance, her old hands busy mending their few clothes, her presence a silent, unwavering anchor. She never questioned, never complained. Sometimes, as Ada struggled to lift a beam into place, Martha would begin to hum an old lullaby, a thread of sound so fragile it seemed the wind might carry it away, yet it was enough to give her daughter the strength for one more push. The town had cast them out to die, but here, in the heart of this wooden giant, they were slowly, painstakingly, building a life from the splinters of the one that had been shattered. Slowly, the hollow space began to transform. It was no longer just a cavity in a tree, it was a room, a sanctuary. Ada constructed a small hearth and chimney against the thickest part of the tree's inner wall, using flat river stones she carried in a sling on her back. The work was slow, a puzzle of weight and balance. Each stone had to fit perfectly, sealed with the same mud and moss mixture she used for the walls. The first time she lit a fire, the smoke drew perfectly up the flue and out a gap high in the tree's broken crown. The small flame pushed back the damp chill, its light dancing on the curved, dark walls, and for the first time in months, a genuine warmth spread through Ada's chest, a heat that had nothing to do with the fire. She built a raised bed frame in the corner, weaving a mattress from fragrant pine boughs and covering it with the one good quilt she'd been allowed to take. It was small, and she and her mother would have to share it, but it was theirs. Every object had a story of struggle, the rough-hewn table made from a fallen log, the two stools she'd painstakingly carved with a knife and a rock, the shelf for their meager supplies. There were no adornments, no comforts beyond the essential. The beauty of the place was in its existence alone. It was a testament to sheer will. At night, with the fire crackling and the immense, silent bulk of the Sequoia surrounding them, the world outside fell away. The judgments of the town, the ghost of her cruel husband, the gnawing fear of the future, they all seemed to shrink, held at bay by the thick, living walls of their improbable home. "It is a good place, daughter," Martha whispered one evening, her voice thin as cobwebs, as she watched the firelight. "It is strong." Ada looked at her mother's wrinkled face, illuminated by the gentle glow, and felt a profound sense of peace. They were two women, dismissed as weak and useless, sheltered in the heart of a wounded giant. They were all still standing. They were all still strong. As summer bled into a crisp, golden autumn, the reality of their isolation began to press in. The forest, once a place of bounty, grew quiet. The berry bushes were stripped bare, the squirrels had hidden their winter stores, and the deer became wary, elusive ghosts in the deepening woods. Ada's days were consumed by a relentless, anxious cycle of gathering. She set snares for rabbits, her stomach twisting each time she found one caught, the necessity of the act warring with the sorrow it brought. She fished in the creek until her fingers turned blue, her catch growing smaller each day as the water chilled. The growing stack of firewood outside their tree home was her obsession, a visual measure of their chances against the coming cold. She knew it wasn't enough. The nights grew teeth, biting deep with a frost that left the world rimed in silver each morning. Inside the tree, the small fire was a hungry god that demanded constant tribute. Martha had developed a cough, a dry, rattling sound that echoed in the small space and sent a spike of fear through Ada with every rasp. She brewed teas from pine needles and willow bark, ancient remedies her grandmother had taught her, and spooned thin broth into her mother's mouth, watching her with a hawk's vigilance. The world was shrinking, contracting around their tiny point of existence. The trips to the forest's edge for a glimpse of the town, of other human life, had stopped. The town had forgotten them, written them off as dead, and Ada found she preferred it that way. Their survival was a private, sacred thing, not to be witnessed or judged. One afternoon, a single, perfect snowflake drifted down from a sky the color of slate and landed on the back of her hand. It melted almost instantly, a tiny, cold tear. It was a warning. A promise. The first snow had arrived, and the true test was about to begin. They had survived the judgment of men. Now they had to survive the judgment of nature. The storm did not arrive, it descended. It fell from the sky not as individual flakes but as a solid, suffocating curtain of white, erasing the world in an instant. One moment, Ada was outside, securing a top over her precious woodpile. The next, she was blind, lost in a swirling vortex of wind and snow just steps from her own door. The air turned thick, each breath a gasp of ice crystals. The sound was a physical force, a deafening, grinding roar that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the earth. It was not the wind howling, it was the world screaming. She stumbled back into the tree's opening, pulling the heavy, plank-and-hide door shut behind her, the roar diminishing to a muffled, omnipresent thunder. The tiny, protected space within the Sequoia became the only real place left in existence. Outside was a formless, violent chaos. Martha was huddled by the fire, her eyes wide, her hands gripping the edge of her worn shawl. The flickering light of the small hearth cast their shadows, huge and distorted, against the curved wooden walls, making them look like ancient spirits trapped in amber. The cold was a living entity, seeping through infinitesimal cracks in Ada's chinking, slithering across the floor in icy drafts. The fire, which had seemed so robust just an hour before, now looked pitifully small, a single flickering candle against an encroaching ocean of darkness and cold. Ada piled more wood onto the grate, ignoring the frugal voice in her head that screamed to conserve it. Tonight was not about tomorrow. Tonight was about surviving the next minute, the next hour. The tree itself seemed to groan under the assault, the ancient wood creaking and groaning as the wind hammered against it. It was a sound that should have been terrifying, but to Ada, it was strangely comforting. The old giant was fighting with them, its immense bulk a shield against the fury of the storm. They were inside its heart, and it was holding them safe. But the storm was just beginning. And their woodpile was finite. Hour 1. The initial shock had passed, replaced by a grim, focused reality. The single task was the fire. Every other thought, food, water, the future, was an indulgence. The fire was life. Ada sat before the stone hearth, feeding it sticks and small logs with the precision of a surgeon, conserving the larger pieces for the deepest hours of the night. The wind's assault was relentless, a physical battery against their shelter. It found a small, undiscovered gap near the top of the door frame, and a fine powder of snow began to hiss onto the floor, melting into a dark, spreading stain. She plugged it with a spare rag, her fingers already stiffening with the cold. Hour 6. The world outside was an abyss of black and white fury. The roar had not lessened, it had deepened, taken on a vengeful, grinding tone. The woodpile inside was now half its original size. A cold dread, far more chilling than the drafts on the floor, began to creep into Ada's heart. She looked at her mother, who had fallen into a fitful, shallow sleep, her breath a faint, white puff in the frigid air. Martha's cough had worsened, a deep, wet rattle that sounded like drowning. Ada knew, with a certainty that stole her own breath, that if the fire went out, her mother would not see the dawn. A terrible choice began to form in her mind, a calculation that felt like a betrayal of all her hard work. The small table. The 2 stools. The shelf on the wall. They were more than objects, they were symbols of her defiance, of her ability to create a home from nothing. They were proof. But proof wouldn't keep her mother warm. Hour 12. Midnight. The heart of the storm. The temperature had plummeted. The water in their bucket was a solid block of ice. Ada's movements were slow, her mind thick and sluggish from cold and exhaustion. She had done it. She had broken the stool apart, its dry wood catching quickly, burning hot and fast. It bought them an hour. Now, she was looking at the table. Her hands trembled as she ran them over its rough surface, the memory of the effort it took to build it fresh in her mind. It's just wood, she whispered to herself, the word swallowed by the storm's howl. It wasn't just wood. It was a piece of her. But Martha shivered violently in her sleep, a low moan escaping her lips. Ada picked up the axe. The sound of the wood splitting inside the tiny cabin was sharp and final, a counterpoint to the raging symphony outside. She fed the pieces of her home into the fire, one by one, to keep her mother alive. The silence was the first thing she noticed. It was not a gentle quiet, but a heavy, profound absence of sound that pressed in on her ears, making them ring. The storm had broken. After what felt like an eternity of roaring chaos, the world had fallen mute. Ada slowly, stiffly, pushed against the door. It wouldn't budge. A wall of snow, solid and dense, had packed against it. Panic, cold and sharp, flared in her chest before she beat it down. She put her shoulder into it, grunting with the effort, and finally managed to shove it open a few inches. The light that streamed through the gap was blinding, a pure, painful white reflected off a landscape that was utterly alien. The world she knew was gone, buried beneath a blanket of snow so deep it had smoothed every edge, erased every landmark. The forest was a collection of white mounds and pillars, the trees heavy-laden, their branches bowed as if in prayer. It was beautiful and terrifying, a world wiped clean. She squeezed through the opening and sank to her waist in the powder. The air was frigid, but clean and still. She looked towards the valley where the town lay. There was no smoke, no sign of life. Just an endless, undulating sea of white. For a moment, she felt a pang of something, not concern, but a strange sense of loss. They were down there, the people who had judged her, who had predicted her demise. Were they warm? Were they safe? Or had the storm been as merciless with them? A profound sense of separation washed over her. She and her mother had faced the end of the world in the heart of a tree, and they had survived. The contrast was stark. Outside, a world of pristine, frozen death. Inside, in the fire-blackened, cramped space, was life. Her mother was breathing, a slow, steady rhythm now. The fever had broken. The fire was down to glowing embers, fed by the last of her handcrafted furniture. She had burned her home to save her family. And standing there, in the silent, white dawn, she knew she would do it again without a second's hesitation. It was 3 days before they came. 3 days of profound silence, in which Ada and her mother regained their strength, rationing the last of their food. Ada had managed to clear a path from their door, her world a small trench carved into the immense whiteness. On the third morning, she saw them, a line of dark figures, struggling through the deep drifts, moving slowly from the direction of the town. It was a search party. Not for her, she assumed. They were likely looking for lost livestock or a hunter who hadn't returned. She watched them from the cover of the trees, her heart beating a little faster. It was the sheriff leading them, the same man who had watched impassively as Jacob threw her out. As they drew closer, their search seemed to falter. They were in the area where her shelter was, but they saw nothing, just the impossible mound of a giant sequoia. They were about to turn back when a thin, pale wisp of smoke curled up from the top of the tree's broken crown and vanished into the blue sky. The men stopped. They stared. One of them pointed, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "What in God's name is that?" The sheriff squinted, his face a mask of disbelief. They approached the tree cautiously, as if it might be a bear's den. When they saw the small, cleared path leading to a solid-looking door set into the side of the trunk, they stopped dead. The sheriff slowly walked to the entrance and knocked. Ada opened it. She stood there, framed in the dark opening, her face smudged with soot, her expression unreadable. Behind her, in the warm, firelit interior, they could see an old woman lying under a quilt, alive. The sheriff's mouth opened, but no words came out. He stared from Ada to the stone hearth, to the neatly stacked remnants of firewood, to the impossible reality of the warm, dry space carved into the heart of a dead tree. He took off his hat, his hand trembling slightly. We thought you were gone," he stammered, his voice thick with an emotion Ada couldn't name. It wasn't pity. It was awe. In the weeks that followed, the story of the woman who lived in a tree spread through the valley like wildfire. The awe the sheriff had shown was mirrored, in its own way, by the rest of the town. They spoke of her not with pity, but with a kind of grudging reverence. They called her resilient. they called her strong. They used words that they never would have associated with the quiet, dismissed wife of Jacob. Supplies began to appear at the edge of the woods near her home, a sack of flour, a parcel of salted meat, a new axe with a fine, sharp edge. There were no notes, no grand gestures. They were quiet offerings, tokens of respect left for a woman who had proven them all profoundly wrong. Ada accepted them with a quiet dignity, but she did not seek their company. She had forged her independence in isolation and fire, and she was not eager to give it up. The respect of the town was a welcome change, but it was not what had saved her. Her own hands, her own will, the steadfast love of her mother, those were the things that had mattered. Her home within the Sequoia was no longer just a shelter, it was a part of her. She had healed its hollow places with her own labor, and in return, it had protected hers. She had become as rooted and resilient as the ancient giant she called home. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, as she sat with her mother by the fire, she would think back to the words that had condemned her. She would be dead by first snow. The men on the porch had seen a fragile woman, a broken family, a hopeless situation. They saw an ending. They had failed to see that sometimes, the most broken things, a hollowed-out tree, a hollowed-out life, are not empty. They are simply open, waiting for something new to take root. They had predicted her death, but in doing so, they had given her the one thing she needed most, a reason to prove them wrong, a reason to build a life where they insisted none could possibly grow. And in the heart of the woods, in the deepest part of the snow, she had